Hello everyone, welcome to Logical Fallacy. My name is Sean, and as you can see, I am calm. I am perfectly at least a lot calmer than I was last week. I am coming into this video with an open mind. We aren't going to get upset. We aren't going to overthink it. We are about to get into the second part of the game theory FNAF timeline, the ultimate timeline, the rise of Afton. And I've been thinking about FNAF a lot this week and just coming up with my own theories and hopefully maybe, potentially releasing my own video would be really cool, although, still not guaranteed. But let's just jump into this and see what MatPat has to say. This is just a theory, guys, so let's just, have a little bit of an open mind here. Alright, here we go.
Hello, Internet! Welcome to Game Theory, and officially page 7 of the FNAF timeline scripts.
Hey,
Last time we covered the origins of Freddy's. We talked about William Afton's childhood dream project of making a singing bear come to life, and the infuriating moment that his dream is copied by a rival restaurant franchise looking to steal away his success. The merger of the two franchises results in William meeting Henry, a brilliant designer with a knack for robotics. Working together, they make Fredbear's flourish, spawning popular Saturday morning cartoon shows, toy lines, and spin-off restaurants under the Fazbear name. When last we left him, Afton was thriving, the world of robotics opening his eyes to new and exciting ways of bringing characters to life. Bringing things to life, yeah, that was his core driving force, his passion. And it was this very passion that would mutate, twist, and morph from here on out in the story. Because with life, there is inevitably death, something that Afton would become intimately familiar with. But before Afton...
Extremely intimately, in fact, he may even experience it himself one day. So kind of recapping my feelings about the last video real quick, my main problems with the last video, I think that a lot of it is right. And kind of overviewing it, I've kind of changed my perspective on some of it. I don't think the timeline starts in the 30s. I still think that's ridiculous. There's not really a whole lot of evidence to suggest that. The advertisements for Fredbears, and then if you look further down, it said Freddy's. So this is obviously pre-established within the franchise. It's not coming really earlier on. It's just a black and white version of a already existing advertisement because it's cheaper to print them in black and white, and whenever you're handing them out to the masses just casually to just get the word out there, So as far as that, that's not really like unusual, but obviously, there's a lot more there. As far though as like the thing that I really didn't like was the fact that the mediocre melodies come so soon. I don't think that's accurate. Mostly because if Afton was just running a business where he was just in a costume, first of all, his business most likely would not have been as successful. The whole point is that it is animatronics, right? Like Chuck E. Cheese, it's not just a bunch of dudes in mascot suits walking around. The whole point was it's a stage performance with animatronics, and that's really cool. For kids, that's what makes it classic. And that's kind of what was popular as that and during the times. I think I looked it up, and the rise of like animatronics was like increasing at an exponential rate around like, I think from the 70s all the way up to like the 90s when Chuck E. Cheese was like predominantly popular. But if you were worried about copyright, you'd have to have something to be worried about. And if Freddy Fazbear's or Fredbear's was actually just Afton in a homemade costume, it wouldn't really be that popular. He wouldn't have to worry about that. It was what made it special was the advanced animatronics that had never been to the level that they were, that Henry and Afton were able to create. So I don't think the mediocre melodies, I actually think those come in during kind of like around 1983. And then that's whenever they were bought out by Fazbear Entertainment, or more accurately by the, whatever it was called, that was the overall corporation at the time. And then basically that business quickly failed because they were cheap knockoffs, right? And they were bought off and used as a jumping off point for other locations. So that's kind of my theory for that. Sorry if it takes so much time, but let's just get into
acquaints
this.
himself with death, I want you to take some time to acquaint yourself with our newest channel.
Yes,
guys,
I heard
this
about
is a
this.
huge moment for us theorists. For the last decade, we've had this 4-player
2011.
controller icon, and now we finally fill in the final missing piece.
What
Get
is it,
ready for the
guys?
rollout of our newest theorist channel. Drum roll, please.
Well, our
Style theory,
style
where we're
theory,
looking at the
nice.
science, math, psychology, history, and mystery of the way you look, your clothing, fashion trends,
it's pretty
hygiene, and
interesting.
makeup. Now, I know that theorizing about style might sound weird at first, but hear me out. I
think
grew
it'll
up
be good.
not understanding style or fashion at all. Admittedly, I was a bit of a hot mess, blissfully ignorant to the impact
Oh my
that style
goodness.
has over your life and how the world treats
That's
you.
great.
But over time, by educating myself on the ins and outs of the fashion industry, I was better able to achieve my true self and find my own sense of personal style. And that right there, that builds confidence. The way that you look directly affects the way that you feel and the way that other people treat you. So understanding those rules and being able to take some control over all of that is incredibly valuable. It's an
That's
educational curve. And what do we do on these channels? We like to educate you while entertaining you, which
Hey,
honestly is
I
why I think
appreciate
this
that.
channel is so important for us to launch. There are so many lies and half-truths in the fashion
Big
industry
fashion.
that there needs to be someone out there to say, hey, this is right, this is wrong, and this
Hey,
is what
Loki's got peak
science
fashion,
says.
all right?
Also, you know, we're gonna have a lot of fun because talking about fashion is weird. Like, this channel has already given me the excuse to bludgeon a ballistic
shoes
head
kill?
to death using a high heel.
Oh gosh.
It's also the channel where we're gonna physically be testing the viability of female armor, or how many t-shirts it takes to stop a
interesting.
bullet. There's also practical everyday stuff too on this channel. Do school uniforms actually benefit the students? Does it make a difference
The
whether or
classic
not you
debate.
wash your legs in the shower? That's the sort of stuff that you can find on this new channel. In fact,
Okay.
there are 5 new episodes that you can check out right after you finish
Nice.
this beast
Yeah,
of an
I did
upload.
look at
I
that
personally
earlier.
recommend starting with the Killer Heel episode because this episode's all about the birth of a killer. And while you're over
Very
there,
true.
consider subscribing. It'll do all of us over here a huge favor, because if we manage to get 1 million subscribers by the end of the month, it'll put us as a top fashion channel here on YouTube. Show the world that looking
That'd be
smart
cool.
can be even better than looking cool. So go ahead, enjoy your all-day theory marathon.
I love that. I love that. I think that's gonna do really well. Also, just want to say I am in the 50,000 subscriber club, but I could have been better because I looked at that channel earlier, I believe, if I'm not mistaken, and I didn't hit the subscribe button whenever I found it because I thought it was like not real, but it was. That made me sad. But you know what? It's fine. It's fine. Don't worry about it. We're good. We're here for,
Marathon. And now
we're
with our
here.
logo complete, it's time
for
to
the
complete our
animatronics.
other massive ongoing project, this timeline.
Ah.
Onward to part 2, where things are about to get
Here
dark
we
in a
go.
hurry. 1983, business was booming with 2 whole restaurant franchises running, Fredbear's Family Diner and the newly opened Freddy Fazbear's Pizza. Together,
Okay.
William and Henry had been able to take the hybrid suit idea and make it into a reality. They called their new invention the Springlock suit, and fittingly enough, it was symbolic of the partnership between these 2 men, a human suit as designed by William that could become a freestanding Henry-style robot. But because it was still new tech with kinks to work out, the rollout was limited, restricted only to the Fredbear's Family Diner location. All of this meant that William was busier than ever. He didn't have time to be a full-time parent, so he designed a nanny cam system where cameras and speakers were hidden throughout the neighborhood, as well as in his youngest son's favorite toy, Psychic Friend Fredbear. I mean, plushy Fredbear. But since cameras just
Psychic
weren't enough to
friend
raise a kid, he
Fredbear,
also left
let's go.
childcare duties to his eldest son, Michael. There was just one problem with that. Michael was far from the best babysitter. He tormented his younger brother by jump-scaring him with a Foxy mask and constantly
That's just being a brother. I don't, traumatizing your younger brother, that's just what brothers do, okay? I mean, that's nothing new.
left him behind. William watched all of it from his cameras. Kids would be kids. Tomorrow was another day, after all. Except Michael's torment didn't stop. Bitter, angry thoughts would run through Michael's mind. Why did he have to be the one to take care of this whining crybaby all the time? It just wasn't fair. It was time
Crybaby.
that he got even with his brother by playing the ultimate prank. A prank that just so happened to be on this crying child's birthday. He and his friends would take his scared little brother and make him do the one thing that he was terrified of doing, getting close to the animatronics. That would be embarrassing for the kid that was such an embarrassment to him. His brother squirmed, screamed, kicked, and fought, but just as they were putting that small, squirming boy up to
goodness.
Fredbear's
This is
lips,
putting
the
this,
mouth snapped shut. The sensitive spring locks inside the body had been triggered by the boy's movements, and they'd immediately clamped down. The wriggling stopped. The boy went limp, but it was just a prank. It was meant to be funny. The boy was taken to the hospital and was immediately given an IV. Flowers and pills filled the nightstand next to his hospital bed, but the damage was too severe. He couldn't recover. As the younger brother's consciousness began to fade, he could hear Michael's last words, a small and flimsy apology. But his father, Williams, through the voice of the Fredbear plush, were a firm and committed promise to a dying son. You're broken. I will put you back together. This would not be the end. No matter what, Williams' son would live again. It would just take time. Time that, right now, he just didn't have. His young son's heart flatlined as the boy faded into the inky unknown of the afterlife. In the aftermath of the tragedy, changes started happening around the restaurants. Kids were now required to wear security wristbands to prevent anyone from getting outside without parental permission. Any kid who approached the exit without permission would have to answer to the security puppet, a marionette on strings that could fly around on rails across the restaurant to stop kids in their tracks. It was Williams' idea, inspired by Michael constantly leaving the restaurant without his brother. In the wake of Fredbear's spring lock failure, all the hybrid suits were getting retired, locked away at the nearby Freddy Fazbear location. It was yet another tough pill to swallow after all the hard work that he and Henry had put into them. William would eventually bury the boy's small body in a remote location out in the woods right alongside his drive into and out of work every day. The death of this little boy sent the family spiraling. His wife, crippled with grief, was so
It's a pile of dirt! Okay, so we still haven't... So obviously now he's going to place the nightmare animatronics as terrorizing Michael, which is a common theory I don't agree with, but, you know, it's common. If it's
distraught that all she could do was sit and watch TV, but his son Michael was far worse. Complaining of seeing hallucinations of a golden bear standing outside of his window, the boy was so racked with guilt that he was convinced that he was being haunted by the ghost of his brother stuck inside the suit that took his life. The suit's three-toed feet digging into the wet earth, the words "it's me" ringing through Michael's ears. Some nights, Michael would even go so far as to break out of his room to check the gravesite and ensure that his brother was still there. As for William himself, he disappeared into his work and his drinks. Junior's, the local bar, wasn't far from his son's gravesite. He found himself going there more and more frequently, spending...
What? Hold on. How does that make sense? So you're saying that he imagined it, yet supposedly that's not Michael. That would be Afton, wouldn't it? I know it's a different sprite, but what he says is, oh, he went to that place again. He's going to be sorry when he gets back. Why would Michael say that? Like, who is he talking about then? Like, he's checking to see if if the crying child supposedly is still dead? I'm not sure how that makes sense. Also, if it was just an hallucination, why are there like literal footprints, which makes sense since it's raining, it's gonna be muddy. How does that make sense?
Longer and longer amounts of time there. The bar gave him a place to think, to remember, to reflect and stew on how Henry had stolen his idea for an animal-themed restaurant, how they'd cut his character out of the cartoon when everyone else was there, how Henry had humiliated him by buying him out of bankruptcy, and now there was his son. Henry had taken his son from him. The robotic part was the part that failed after all. William ordered one more drink, but it was one too many. The bar turned him out and told him to go home. But William didn't go home. Drunk and angry, William raced back to the restaurant to give Henry a piece of his mind, only to find someone else waiting. Henry's daughter, Charlie, locked outside of the building, bullies laughing at her through the window. Fine, some other problem to fix. But then Afton got an idea, a beautifully awful idea. This was his chance to get back at the man that had humiliated him all those years ago. Henry had killed his business, and now Henry's robotic suit had killed his son. It was time for William to do some killing of his own. Let Henry feel what it's like to have something you love get ripped away. While parties continued inside the walls of the pizzeria, William attacked Charlie in the back alley. It felt good. He felt free. The years of resentment and bitterness trapped in his heart finally released in a moment of pure unapologetic evil. He would make Henry hurt like he hurts.
I'm sorry, I shouldn't be laughing, but...
And in that moment, William became a killer. He dropped Charlie's lifeless body and drove home. forced to confront his family problems later that night, appalled, but also a little excited by what he had just done. Charlie's death would remain on the books as a random act of violence, and though Henry had suspicions about William, there was no physical evidence, nothing that could link him back to the crime. In the weeks that followed, Fredbear's family diner would close for good. 2 high-profile deaths around the restaurant with 2 grieving owners in such a short period of time was just too much bad press to handle. Besides, Freddy Fazbear's was still open, and it was the newer restaurant anyway. All the equipment from the diner, including the old yellow suits and security puppet, would get retired to that location, and there they would sit for 2 uneventful years. The rest of 1983 and 1984 were spent quietly grieving. Freddy Fazbear's Pizza and the new cast of characters were a hit. Tragic memories of their yellow predecessors quickly faded. Afton kept a low profile and buried himself in work and research, quickly reaching Henry's level of engineering and even surpassing him. And while Henry slowed down to grieve, Afton kept going, even starting his own company, Afton Robotics, for all those pet projects that were a little bit too experimental for the regular operations of the pizzeria. The first of these experimental projects was a secret work.
Yeah, but what about the monitors, though, that are in sister location that show FNAF 4, the rooms? That would mean that sister location would have to exist before then, right? Am I missing something?
Workshop under his house, a veritable bunker, which allowed him to work while still monitoring his kids via hidden security cameras. 1983. A passcode that served as a constant reminder of why the cameras were so important, why he was down there in the first place. This was all to fulfill the promise that he had made to his son, right? I will put you back together. This was for him, all for him, right? But cameras weren't enough. He needed to solve the runaway Michael problem. He had to keep him in the house. He couldn't have another one of his kids wind up dead inside of an animatronic suit. So why not run a little experiment on Michael? You see, all this work with Henry had gotten Afton to start learning more about life, robots, the human mind, and what a fallible machine we as humans were. Our reality is so easy to manipulate with a few sensory deceptions. Deceptions like sound. With just a few sounds, he had discovered that he could alter a person's vision. He could transform blank, smooth plastic robots into lumbering, twisted nightmares. Nightmares far scarier than he could create with actual materials. They would appear organic, rotting, putrid, terrifying. These would be his means of keeping his son Michael in the house where he belonged. Was it extreme? Maybe. But then again, this was the boy who had killed his son. He would make him sorry. And so Michael would grow up not only dealing with the memories of his own guilt, the hospital room, the pills, the flowers, the death of his brother, but also facing literal nightmares, illusions created by sound. Michael would never forget these either. Years later, as a security guard, he would still draw pictures of them inside of his logbook. But all of these extra projects meant that his home life suffered even more. He was an absent father and a non-existent husband, leaving his wife cold and alone.
Why do you hide inside your walls when there is music in my halls?
That's eerie.
All I see is an empty room. No more joy, an empty tomb.
That's freaking terrifying.
And despite her repeated demands that he leave his office and engage with the family, he refused time and time again, leaving her no choice but to leave.
You burned down my house?
You call that a house? It was like a morgue in there. You need to see your son.
The baby isn't mine.
Well, how's this? I'm keeping the diamond ring.
And through it all, there was one lingering feeling. William wasn't done. He had gotten a taste of what it felt like to be unleashed, what it felt like to be free. Charlie's murder had unlocked something in him, and he wanted more. June 26th, 1985. Putting on the golden Bonnie suit, he lured children one by one to the back room of the pizzeria when no one was looking. At first, he was cautious. He would lure them with promises of cake and cookies. He told them that their dog had died. He would ask for help with homework. Susie was the first. You never truly forget your first.
I was the first. I have seen everything.
But where to hide the bodies? He couldn't sneak out. Someone would see him. He had to hide them in a place where they'd never be found and where they'd never leave the building. They had to be stuffed.
Yeah.
Stuffed inside of the suits. No one maintained those things anyway except for him. And so Susie would go into Chica. Fritz, Jeremy, and Gabriel would come next. But it was easy. It was too easy. And with each little life he snuffed out, his lies got bigger. Their house was burning. They're just being kidnapped. Until the last one where all pretense was off. He let himself get violent. Too violent.
I'll
I'll just wait for him after school, throw a bag over his head, hit him with a shovel, and drag him into the back of my car.
The body of Cassidy was far more bloody and broken than any of the others. He'd let himself go too far. That one he shouldn't have killed. With no more active animatronics left, he shoved the body into the one suit that remained backstage. The long-forgotten yellow Fredbear, now broken and discolored with age.
Okay, so... I guess that makes sense. So obviously this is a reference to Ultimate Custom Night, which is Cassidy playing with Afton's mind. And those cutscenes, it makes me wonder if maybe those are Afton's memories kind of bleeding through, or maybe it's Cassidy kind of showing him his memories of like how he convinced himself. But that's weird. I don't know. There's some interesting aspects because I don't know. There's some weird things in those cutscenes that are a bit hard to explain.
Broken,
kind of
like Cassidy was broken, like his son was broken. Newspapers reported on this disappearance, naming the whole thing the missing children's incident. Police would even charge William with the crimes after finding security footage of the golden mascot suit luring kids to the back, but they couldn't convict him. They had no bodies, and his face had been hidden behind the mascot suit the entire time. What they had was circumstantial at best, and so he walked away a free man. But Henry knew the truth. In these murders, he saw his daughter Charlie all over again, so he threw Afton out of the company and shuttered the doors to the old pizzeria. Henry would keep the franchise quiet for 2 years. This would not happen again. This could not happen again. How could he protect the kids? Finally, he developed a solution. He would implement an even more extreme security system in the form of new animatronics, toy animatronics, inspired by the toys that they had been selling years ago. But these guys, these were special. They were a new breed of robot with facial recognition abilities.
But most importantly, they're all tied into some kind of criminal database, so they can detect a predator a mile away.
All the original animatronics, now withered with age, were moved to the new location. With a plan in place, it was time to try.
Okay, so MatPat, let me follow you here. So apparently, as far as I'm aware, FNAF 1 is set quite a bit down the road as far as the timeline goes. As far as I can kind of like tell, it's set in 1993 is what kind of when people are saying it is. And the reason they're saying that is because it seems likely because there's a line in there that says these animatronics have been basically pre-established for 20 years, like beloved by kids for over 20 years. So that would put them, presumably Fredbear's diner being open around 1973, which sort of makes sense if you think about it. And that gives it like 10 years of development between 1973 and 1983. First of all, we've gotten no mention of Elizabeth Afton, I don't think. She hasn't died yet. That's kind of weird. Also, Michael being... First of all, it has been pre-established in multiple secondary canonical books and things that the crying child, in fact, is the FNAF 4 child. Literally, in the encyclopedia, it says the crying child. In the Ultimate Survival Guide, it says the crying child, I believe, if I'm not mistaken. And look, I know it's a theory, so it's like one of those things where they're not going to immediately disprove it either way. However, they've not said it just once. They've said it like multiple times throughout the encyclopedia, which is written by Scott, directly saying it's the crying child, which makes sense because presumably at this point, it's a bit... So Michael goes to... Yeah, we haven't heard anything about Circus Baby's Pizza World or the circus. And if Afton is kicked out by Henry at this point, how is he going to do that?
Try once more. The year was 1987, and the new and improved Freddy Fazbear's Pizza...
Because... Okay, how is this happening in 1987, though? Because they replaced the old FNAF characters. But the FNAF 1 characters were open until after 1993. Because in FNAF 1, it's mentioned about the bite of 1987. Unless that's a completely separate location, but it's Freddy Fazbear's Pizza, right? this is from FNAF 2, which happens directly after, a few years after 1993, after FNAF 1, after Michael has presumably already died, come back, and is going throughout the locations searching for Springtrap and burning down the location. So that's like further down in the timeline. Well, but it's not until FNAF 2 that Springtrap is created. Which makes sense, because then it's 30 years later in 2023. So you got 1993. So presumably the next location would be, yeah, so like 1993, then 30 years later, you have, and what, this is all theoretical, like this is all based on presumed theories based upon what we have, because we have 20 years, and then 30 years later, you got the Fazbear Frights location. How is this, how does he explain that? Like, the animatronics, the second generation, don't come until much later. It is possible that they were still in development, but this was a PR stunt because it was based on the show. These were based on the toys, and so it was meant to pull away from, like, the animatronics. You know, like, everything they had done, and more about, like, oh, they're kid-friendly, they look finally sort of kind of cute, because they're based on the toys, and that's nostalgia. I'm a bit confused.
So it was making headlines in local newspapers. Headlines that just so happened to catch the attention of William Afton. Freddy's was back, and without him, that was his idea.
Like, this
his
is happening
character.
in 1987?
Henry was, yet again, trying to cut him out of the picture. No. As long as these restaurants stayed open, William would always come back. Then he noticed the phone number to apply at the bottom of the article. $100 a week to apply, call. Afton would go back, not as an owner or co-founder. He would go back in the one place that they would least suspect him, a lowly day shift security guard. And there it was, buried in the back of parts and services, mixed in with the old withered animatronics, was the golden rabbit. With the yellow security badge still on his chest, he used his crank to pull open the spring locks. It was time for Bonnie to give an encore performance.
Okay.
Someone used one of the suits.
Yeah,
this, okay. A yellow one. Someone.
I thought he was going to say that he was the security guard, because that would make no sense, but no, because when you're the security guard, when you are on shift, that's when he sneaks in on that last day, and that's whenever he gets Springtrap, because he dismantles all the animatronics.
Used it. Now none of them are acting right. From what I understand, the building is on lockdown. No one is allowed in or out, you know, especially concerning any previous employees. When we get it all sorted out, we may move you to the day shift. A position just became available.
1987, 5 more kids. He didn't know what felt better, getting back into the suit after 2 long years of waiting, or knowing how devastating this would be to Henry the next morning. He didn't even try to hide his crime this time, just meant more blood on Henry's hands. He'd failed to protect the kids again. The restaurant had only been open for a few weeks, but William was sure that this would get it to close. Good, if he couldn't have Freddy's, no one would. Whenever a new pizzeria opened, he would be there. But as he sat in his bunker, something else started to linger in William's mind. He had seen something strange. The old withered animatronics, they had been wandering around the building, spurred on by the puppet. It was almost like those old robots were trying to save the kids. Save them? They couldn't, obviously, but still, how were they moving? It was almost like they had been given life somehow. Did he have something to do with that? The following day, the news would report a security guard getting bitten by one of the animatronics during the day shift. Was that bite meant for him? William's curiosity was stronger now than his bloodlust. He had to learn more, but how? There was no way he'd ever be able to get inside another Freddy's Pizzeria. Heck.
But what evidence is there to say that this is happening in 1987? I don't know all of the lore, guys. I'm not completely 100% versed in every single book, every single thing. But in FNAF 1, which if these are the retired versions of the FNAF 1, then how is it mentioned the bite of 87, and then it closes down for a few years, and then in 1993, presumably that's whenever... It's somewhere in there. It's not like for sure, but it definitely happens after 1987. It doesn't happen during.
There was practically no way a Freddy's would ever open again.
It's a freaking long video,
to create
guys.
something new, something brand new. He needed to create his own pizzeria.
Due to the massive success, and even more so the unfortunate closing of Freddy Fazbear's Pizza, it was clear that the stage was set, no pun intended, for another contender in children's entertainment.
Circus Baby's Pizza World. This would be the place where he could continue his work. No longer just murdering, experimenting. He needed more kids, and he needed them alive. And knowing that he couldn't show his face on the restaurant floor, he needed a way of remotely capturing his victims and preserving them for his work. With that goal in mind, he designed a new breed of animatronic. Their endoskeletons fluid and flexible. He equipped them with sound lures that could mimic voices. They could isolate children. They could incapacitate and contain them with zero direct input from him. It was brilliant. He was brilliant. Far beyond the simple bars and wires.
I don't think that means exactly what he's implying it means, though. This has to be associated with Fazbear Entertainment because it mentions the fact that he's talking to someone on the board of Freddy Fazbear who's reviewing his models. If this was a separate franchise, not connected to Freddy Fazbear, then how in the world would they have the right to tell him, why would he be in front of the board?
Of Henry's designs, and the characters he chose for this were uniquely his. His new roster wasn't going to be tainted by Henry's disgusting barnyard bird. Instead, it was back to his characters, his creations, Freddy, Bonnie, Foxy, as well as two special ones. The first, Ballora, was an homage to the woman who left him. Now she would never leave him again. The second, the titular baby, was designed with his baby in mind, Elizabeth, his youngest child. She would always be Daddy's little girl, the one that listened to him, the one that obeyed. Until the day that she didn't.
Daddy,
she was a spoiled brat.
She's so pretty and shiny. Didn't you make her just for me?
The day before Circus Baby's Pizza World opened, she disobeyed. She didn't listen. Left alone with Baby, she got too close. The animatronic ripped in half and swallowed her whole. A scared and confused child fading into eternal darkness. By the time Afton found her, it was too late. She was gone. He immediately canceled the launch of Circus Babies under the guise of a gas leak. But wait, as he sat there at the foot of the stage, he noticed that something was different. The eye color of the robot had changed. Baby had been built with blue eyes, but now they were emerald green, the same color as Elizabeth's. Was she in there? Could this all be connected to the free-moving animatronics that he had seen at Freddy's? He had to know more. His mourning turned to excitement. He had to return to where it all started. 1993. Pathetic. This place was pathetic. Henry had clearly tried to reopen one final time with those old original animatronics from so long ago, but William's damage to the brand had been permanent. These things stank of death. They hadn't been washed in decades. But even if they had, nothing could wash away the stink of murder that haunted these halls. One night, then another, then another. William repeatedly snuck into the old broken restaurant.
That doesn't explain the FNAF 2 generation of animatronics. There was no pre-established... as far as I'm aware, there's no pre-established lore to actually determine, because FNAF 2 happens after FNAF 1. Like, directly after. Like, it's mentioned, unless the wording is vague enough to where it's like, well, that could happen early in the timeline because it only says a location closed. And locations close like every other decade, so, you know, it could be any of those. I don't know. Maybe that's what it's talking about.
To lure the living animatronics to
Doesn't seem
one
likely,
by
though.
one dismantling them, robbing them of their endoskeletons. The metal had to be the secret. It had to contain the remnants of life itself. But he had to know for sure. Leaping out of a room that was invisible to the animatronics programming, he dragged the oversized robotic skeletons back to his underground workshop, back to where Circus Baby watched on with glowing, curious eyes. Eyes that somehow felt alive. Not knowing what else to do, William melted the robotic parts down. 5 animatronic endoskeletons reduced down to one silvery puddle of goo. Could he transfer this living metal to his own creations? He had to try. He picked up a syringe and filled it with the molten metal and injected the goo into Funtime Freddy's twisted, wiry endoskeleton. And suddenly the coils came to life. Like snakes writhing in a pile, what had once been cold, lifeless metal moved and jolted on its own. He'd done it! He had unlocked the secret to life itself. Except something was clearly wrong. The movements were erratic. They were violent, angry. Baby didn't act this this way. She had been calm, collected. This was clearly something else, something mindless and frantic. Perhaps by mixing the souls and then portioning them out, he had created incomplete beasts. He would need to keep testing to truly understand it. He needed more of this remnant. As he searched the old pizzeria one more time for any remaining scraps of metal, the ghosts attacked. His past victims come to collect their due, all led by Cassidy. The five lined up and blocked the door, and Afton's mind reeled. The scientific implications of this were incredible. Ghosts, real ghosts that he could see, all standing against him. But what could they do? What couldn't they do? He panicked as Cassidy approached. How do you stop something that's already dead? Maybe with the thing that resulted in their death in the first place. He would get into his suit like old times. He would regain his power over them just like the day that they died. He was the genius. He was the one in the suit. He was the one in charge. The spring lock snapped into place. Maybe it was his frantic movements. Maybe it was the leaky abandoned restaurant. Maybe it was just fate coming to collect its due. He didn't know. The only thing he did know was that his brain was suddenly filled with searing white-hot pain as hundreds of metallic pins and gears stabbed into his body from all sides. All he could do was collapse, blood slowly oozing out of the suit and pooling onto the floor around him. It couldn't end like this. It wouldn't end like this. His work was unfinished. Unable to move, his only option was to survive, to live, to keep living. It took days lying in his own blood, but eventually someone found him, a security guard making a normal report. When he saw the animatronics torn apart in the middle of the party room floor, it caused him to file an immediate report of a break-in. An owner would have to come in and claim the damage, and who else would it be other than Henry? Hope jumped in Afton's heart. Henry would see him. They were partners after all. He would be the one to help save him, to get him out of this suit, to relieve him from this tremendous pain. Henry entered the secret room. His eyes fell on Afton sitting there in the pool of red, and Henry, saying nothing, turned and walked away.
This is just to inform all employees that due to budget restrictions, the previously mentioned safe rooms are being sealed at most locations, including this one. Nothing is being taken out beforehand, so if you left anything inside, then it's your own fault. Management also requests that this room not be mentioned to family, friends, or insurance representatives.
And so there Afton would sit, hanging on for 30 years, trapped behind the walls with an iron will that refused to die. End of this part. I say this part because it's not officially the end of the Afton era just yet, but this just felt like a really solid stopping point, and the episode has gone on forever. Okay, so most of this is things that we already knew, stuff that's been established and reestablished time and time again by the games. That said, there are two things that I absolutely have to address. The first and biggest is the placement of sister location, or more specifically, Elizabeth's death. To me, evidence in game seems to suggest that it was meant to come before the crying child's death in 1983. The biggest clue to this is that the crying child saw something. Remember what you saw is the phrase that's repeated over and over.
Also, Afton's standards is really interesting. The fact that, okay, and I know this is gonna blow past what he's actually saying with his theory, but for a second, just suspend all of the things you just heard and assume the crying child is actually in FNAF 4. Like, literally every other piece of content from FNAF actually states. But especially since that entire game literally is just about the crying child. Like, he's the main character. It's his story happening throughout. We don't really get too much about Michael. We've never really gotten too much about Michael except in Sister Location. And to me, yes, Elizabeth Afton's death happens before the crying child because Afton designed those animatronics, and I know that makes everything shift to where everything kind of happens earlier in the timeline where, you know, he suddenly knows about Remnant before 1983, and, you know, he's already murdered the children before 1983. He's had a full decade between 1973 and 1983. I don't think that really anything really triggered Afton to kill. I think that he was already a very unhinged, workaholic, kind of very, very determinist guy who just wouldn't stop working. I think he was, you know, obviously a psychopath and, you know, surely a sociopath. But anyways, regardless, he wasn't right in the mind from the start, I think, honestly. And so I think the murders happened before 1983, potentially. I think that's something that I have in the back of my mind. But it's just a theory. It's just a thought. Calm down, guys. You can have your own ideas and post them in the comments below. I'd love to hear them. All right? But
over again by psychic friend
Fredbear,
Fredbear, aka William Afton speaking through a walkie-talkie in the Fredbear plushie's stomach. But what did he see? Well, I think we can tell based on how the nightmare animatronics are visualized. They have mouths in their stomachs, just like Baby ripping in half at the waist to swallow a kid. There's also the empty girl's room, one presumably left behind by a dead sister. And
there's also a more literal interpretation. It's exactly how they look in the Twisted Ones, guys. I know, we don't like to talk about that fact. We don't, but that's their designs are almost identical to the Twisted Ones. I'm not saying they are, but I think they're the in-universe version of that graphic novel. It's just a theory, guys.
Lastly, it explains why he's scared, and more specifically, why Afton wants him scared. He needs his kids to stay away from the animatronics. He doesn't want them getting too close, because the last time one of his kids got too close to a robot, his daughter died. That's then why he sets up the nightmares, to scare both Mike and the crying child away from the animatronics from that point forward. That's why books like the Character Encyclopedia outright suggest that we play as the crying child in FNAF 4. That's why he has a nanny cam following the crying child everywhere, so he can keep tabs on his kids when they're out of his sight. He can't let another Elizabeth situation happen. The death of Elizabeth also gives William Afton extra motivation for killing. He's a grieving father. His daughter was taken away from him, so Charlie should die as well. He's lashing out at the world after losing his kids. And again, we know that at least one of his children had to have died prior to Charlie's death, based on the mound of dirt that we see in Midnight Motorist. It also allows circus babies to open and close earlier in the timeline, which is how you wind up with Funtime Foxy appearing as Mangle in the FNAF 2 location. Basically, Elizabeth dying first has everything it needs to fit, except for the most important thing, the murder weapon. Why would Afton be building an animatronic with a giant claw in its stomach so early in the timeline? At this point, he just has...
It's not really early in the timeline, though, right? There's been 10 years between Fredbear's opening, if we're presuming, and I know that's presuming a lot, right? But presumably, 1987 happened, and 20 years before then, at some point between 1993 and 1987, 20 years before then is when Fredbear's Family Diner started. But not just that, when these characters were established, right? It's not just the fact that it's just Bonnie, or Spring Bonnie, and Fredbear. It's the fact that the animatronics as we know them, seemingly, or at least the franchise, could just be the franchise, has been established for 20 years, which would set it at 1973 at the earliest, or even the latest. Which means there's 10 years between 1973 and 1983, which means there's a lot of time in between there, guys, of designing the Springtrap animatronics and planning out, because you have to think, like, they had to build up to this, right? Like, they didn't just design it, it was successful, and then that was it, right? They had to get to a point where it was, first of all, worth it for other endeavors to copy them. They had to get to a point where they were able to be popular enough for people to even care about an entire animated series, as well as that animated series doing so well that people would be nostalgic for it later on when they would release Fazbear and Friends on tour. So all of these things need to be in place and pre-established, and there's a lot of time for them to do that. So there's actually a lot of time for all of this to have happened. And I think that would mean the murders would have had to happen earlier in the timeline. And I understand why a lot of people would have issues with that, but it isn't, and it is a possibility. That's all I'm saying. It's a possibility.
No motive. It just doesn't make sense prior to 1983. At this point in the story, he hasn't killed anyone, and we know for a fact that the missing children's incident is 1985. So Elizabeth's death coming before any of those events just doesn't work, hence why I placed it where I did in the narrative timeline. Afton's death here is also a bit tricky. We know that he returned to the FNAF 1 location to break down the original animatronics in order to harvest their remnant. We know that he melts down 5 things to become become one thing. Candy Cadet makes that very clear. So the 5 things are the 5 endoskeletons from the various animatronics. That would be totally fine if it weren't for one huge problem. On his 5th visit to the pizzeria, Afton gets spring-locked. So either the 5 becoming 1 starts in 1993, but then finishes 30 years later when he re-emerges from the wall to add the last endoskeleton to his pile, or he's had himself some reason to return to the original location after harvesting all the stuff that he can. It's not ideal, but it's the one angle that makes the most sense. And with that, this next chapter comes to a close.
It's a big logical leap. It is a very big logical leap that really doesn't have any support. Just being honest, like, you can't just presume things like that and just expect people to accept it. But it is a possibility. I'm not gonna like completely say, oh, it's definitely 100% not true, because we don't know. It's not confirmed.
Thereby leaving us with 5 more games to cover and another 40 plus years of Fazbear history to recap. Ooh, when you put it that way, something tells me that this might balloon into 4 parts. Ugh, we'll see. Anyway, until
don't do that
then,
to me,
my Fazheads, congratulations, you've made it through a massive upload. And hey, if you are still looking for more to watch, then check out the other 5 brand new awesome theories over on our new sister location, Style Theory. This thing literally launched today, so this is your chance to be one of the first people to ever subscribe to this brand new theory channel. Get yourself the bragging rights of being there on day 1 and subscribing. I recommend checking out the video on Killer Heels. I think that one's the best starting spot, and then you just explore the channel from there. And again, if you like what you see, give it a subscribe.
Let's stop it there. Yeah, I've got a few like just logistical issues as far as the timeline goes, where certain events land. But overall, I think that like the events are solid. Like the events, they all happened, right? But timing them, man, that's hard. Especially when it's like, well, and I know the whole time, like halfway, I'm like, we're halfway through this and we haven't heard the name Elizabeth Afton, like at all. Michael's also a weird one, a weird character in the franchise. Because what we didn't get is we didn't get to hear about what happened in Sister Location, like at all, with Michael Afton. Like, I'm guessing we're skipping over Innard, unless I guess according to his timeline, that happens much later. In 1987 was when he said it, or was it 1993? No, it wasn't 1993. It was 1987. So basically, what he's saying is the crying child dies in 1983. First set of murders happened in 1985. Second murders happened in 1987. Sister Location happens between 1983 and 1985. Well, I don't know what he's saying, honestly. I'm really confused. It's a 30-minute video. I'm gonna have to rewatch it over and over again, really to give him justice and like not completely misquote him. But thank you guys so much for joining me. I really appreciate it. I know this was a long video, but I really appreciate it. You know, this was just us having a discussion, so please leave your comments below, subscribe, and I'll see you guys next time.